A story of Cowley. The area of Cowley has been a place of settlement since the Ice Age, with evidence of flint factories from the Bronze Age, a nearby hill fort from Celtic times, and a passing road from the Roman occupation. In Anglo-Saxon times, a manor was built by a local chieftain, and the settlement was called Cooley, or Cofer's Clearing. In 1066, the Norman invasion saw the end of Anglo-Saxon life. Lands were seized by the sword and given over to foreign nobility. A moat and bailey castle was built in Oxford, and the people became prisoners of fear. One man called Tolley held lands at Cowley, but after Doomsday in 1086, he is an undertenant of a Norman baron. The record reveals Cowley as a manor with a small farming community of 47 tenants. Soon after Doomsday, the Crusades began. Knights rode with holy purpose to claim Jerusalem from the infidels. After securing the holy city, 9 knights formed the Knight Templar to protect pilgrims on the road. Meanwhile in Oxford, a man called Geoffrey of Monmouth produced his monumental work, The History of the Kings of Britain. Claiming it to be from a secret lost Celtic manuscript, it details the ancient myth and archetype of Arthur as a Christian warrior king. In Cowley, Matilda of Boulogne gave the manor to the newly formed Knights Templar. They built a church and began to train knights to a life of chastity and poverty as warrior monks. It was believed that England will become the new Jerusalem spoken of in the Book of Revelations. Matilda's son, King Henry II, adopted the tales of Arthur as proof of his own divine right of kingship and granted the Templars land across England to defend the realm. The knights formed the Round Table and set the blueprint for our perilous journey on this road to democracy. Over the next 700 years, the monarchy maintained its divine right to rule. England became Great Britain and expanded as an imperial empire to subdue and govern a third of the planet. But while 5% enjoyed great wealth and privilege, the common people served, fought, and struggled as landless subjects. The Industrial Age saw the end of feudalism and the beginnings of capitalism. The Final Enclosure Acts saw the end of common land, forcing peasants to leave rural life and work in the new factories. Slavery was abolished, and women began to get ownership rights. Children, who had been the main workforce because so many men had died from war and famine, were limited to 10 hours work a day, and the first factory legislation was passed. Industry arrived in Cowley with the founding of the Oxford Steam Plough Company. They manufactured steamrollers, threshing machines, and steam plough sets. The ploughing sets would leave Cowley in the spring, working their way from farm to return again in autumn for an overhaul. Father Benson arrived to serve as vicar of Cowley and had a profound influence on the area. He founded a community whose members lived under rules of poverty and obedience. They advocated an inner contemplative life and simplicity in contrast to the hierarchical elaborations of the church. Known as the Cowley Fathers, they created the first stable Anglican religious order since the Reformation and established missionary work in India, South Africa, and America. A poor law school was built called Cowley Industrial School. It was for orphans, abandoned children, or children whose parents were in the workhouse on Cowley Road. A barracks was built to house the Light Brigade, and the Church Army Press opened a printing press. The manor became Cowley Middle Class School to provide low-cost education for the rising middle classes, and later Oxford Military College, which prepared young men for university and military service. At the turn of the century, Cowley was essentially 3 villages on the outskirts of Oxford: Temple Cowley, Middle Cowley, and Cowley Marsh. In 1910, William Morris designed his first car in Oxford. After receiving an order for 400 cars, he bought the old military college in Cowley and began production on his first model, the Morris Oxford Light Car. The chassis was constructed on the first floor of the manor and the body on the second. Then a steam frame building called the Old Tin Shed was erected on the parade ground to enable an assembly line. By 1916, he developed a 4-seater with a bigger engine and renamed it the Morris Cowley. During the First World War, the factory produced ammunition and bomb casings as well as cars. Women first worked in the factory while the men were away fighting. Following the war, a Great Depression hit the world, but cars were in demand. The factory rapidly expanded, and by 1925 was building 56,000 cars a year. Nuffield Press was founded to print the Morris Owner Motoring magazine, and soon was selling 20,000 copies per issue. Morris formed a partnership with the Budd Company from Philadelphia, and the Pressed Steel Company was founded alongside the factory to produce cars in pressed steel instead of wood frames and panels. About 5,000 people worked for Morris, pulled from the local population, but now more workers were needed and a national call went out. Many people travelled from depressed areas of high unemployment to work in Cowley's factories. The contingent from Wales came on a hunger march for work, some dying of starvation on the road. Housing was needed and new estates were built to accommodate the vast number of immigrants. This made Oxford one of the fastest growing cities with a 42% population increase. The Cowley villages merged and became an extension of East Oxford. William Morris never supported the unions, relying on paternalism instead. He offered a good wage, promoted athletics and leisure activities, promoted a brass band, built a social club, and St. Luke's Church as the local church St. James strained to accommodate the new influx of worshippers. But the pressed steel plant had workers who came from shipyards or were miners. They had trade union memberships and brought their knowledge of striking with them. Union recognition by the plant came in 1934 when 12 women went on a 12-day strike and asked their men to join them. The pressed steel was known as the sweatshop. Conditions were terrible and accidents were rife. The women, who were only paid half of men's wage for the same work, refused to work in slave conditions for pin money. Their brothers recognized their plight and together they went on strike. Better conditions were settled and women were offered union membership. Now they had a voice through the unions in the workplace and through the Women's Institute in the community. In 1938, William Morris became Lord Nuffield in recognition for his innovations and pioneering spirit. During the Second World War, the factories were turned over to the production of war supplies, and the workforce swelled to 10,000, most of whom were women. They produced Crusader tanks, armoured personnel carriers, and Tiger Moth aeroplanes. They also manufactured shell casings, torpedoes, and repaired damaged aircraft. After the war, business boomed. Cars were exported all over the world, and demand often outstripped supply. By the 1950s, production had quadrupled, and new buildings and assembly lines were built. In 1952, the company merged with the Austin Car Company to form the British Motor Corporation. Cowley now was at the centre of the British car industry, competing with America in a new global market. The workers at the factory had immigrated from diverse backgrounds to form new living working communities where for the first time in history a generation of young men and women were free to meet each other, buy or rent a house and start a family, just the two of them instead of generations living under one roof. By the 50s, second and third generation workers were seeking fairer wages, better living conditions and safer working environments. They were a new working class, able to articulate their demands and organize themselves for action. Pressed Steel had embraced the unions, so communication between workers and management was established. But Morris Motors refused to fully recognize them until a strike in 1956 over management-imposed redundancies forced a partial recognition. Management agreed to meet line representatives, but not shop stewards. This left the way for militant, politically motivated stewards to take root and be the cause of the troubles to follow. Much needed to be fought for, as the factory at Pressed Steel was filthy, dark, dangerous, and extremely noisy. Lead dust filled the air, glittering when the sun shone through its high, dirty windows. Smoke from gas and arc welders reduced visibility to 50 yards. Workers in both factories were very pale, and the hospital in the factory was used too often. Labour in both factories was paid by piecework. A foreman decided what work you did and who would be laid off, when demands for cars fluctuated. The work was repetitive, giving no satisfaction, but it left the mind free to dream of a better, fairer life, or to redesign the homes and gardens they could now afford. New waves of immigrants from the Caribbean and Asia began to arrive, taking up the offer of work as bus conductors, nurses and cleaners. Production by the early 60s was at its peak, with the factories running continuously day and night. The streets were a river of bicycles every time the shifts changed. Cowley was a vibrant and prosperous community and known worldwide through its industries. So the City Council chose Middle Cowley to become the home to the first shopping centre in Oxford. The centre of the village was demolished, and a North American-inspired mall and flats was built and named Cowley Centre. Blackbird Leys was built to house the poor from the slum clearances in Oxford and to house unskilled workers from the factories. Both were presented as models for modern community living. The labour movement had grown in opposition to capitalism from the ideals of Karl Marx and his treatise, the Communist Manifesto, and Pope Leo VIII's treatise on the condition of the working classes, in which he advocates limits on the working day, a living wage, the elimination of child labour, the rights of labour to organise, and the duty of the state to regulate labour laws. The unions grew from trade union societies that had been set up to protect the interest of skilled artisans, and the Trade Union Council was formed to be the central body of the organised labour movement in the UK. The Labour Party was set up by the Trade Union Council to be a voice for socialism and to represent the interests and needs of common people in Parliament. As the car production at Cowley grew, so did the influence of the Labour Party, achieving minority governments during the expansion in the 20s and a majority government in the 60s. The workers at Press Steel could communicate their needs to management through union representation and effect changes, but the assembly plant had to resort to unofficial strikes and pre-war tactics to gain a voice. During the 1960s, strikes in the assembly plant averaged over 300 a year, and in 1969 rose to over 600. Press Steel would also close, as production would be halted, with the workers receiving no pay. Through this process, the unions grew very strong. At Press Steel, they learnt about management policies and procedures, and at the assembly plant, they made advances that would not normally be achieved through negotiation. The industry had to meet their demands, as the car industry was growing globally and generating Britain a lot of wealth. The men and women shop stewards became very knowledgeable and empowered about their rights. So like the Knight Templars, who rode out to protect pilgrims on the road, and the Cowley Fathers, who went forth with their missions, the union stewards travelled from Cowley to meetings all over the country to defend and support the civil rights of people in their struggles for better standards of living, better wages and working conditions. In 1968, the Cowley plants became part of British Leyland. The Labour Party was in government, and with the strength of the unions was transforming society with social and educational reforms and the expansion of the welfare state. By the 70s, the global labour movement was making great strides, and a social democracy for the first time was seen as a possibility. Women and ethnic minorities were awarded equal rights and pay and allowed to work on the shop floor in the factory. Oxford was alive with community purpose as students and workers set up campaigns to further the socialist cause. The Cowley Road developed into a vibrant multicultural community of radical activists and artists. East Oxford and its people, from the university to the Cowley Works, became a microcosm in the macrocosm of the social movement towards freedom and a better life. But the working classes were getting too powerful and had to be stopped. The unofficial strikes were affecting business and the reputation of the Labour Party, so the government began legislating against the unions, while business created new multinational corporations that only employ partial or non-unionised labour. The unions became divided as members challenged the radicals. Right and left fought, while the ordinary workers looked on. In the early 70s, British Leyland introduced new corporate structures and new management systems to counter the radicals and the influence of the shop stewards, but in 1974 the company went bankrupt. The government bailed out the company with public funds, and job losses followed. When the Conservatives came in power, further legislation, industrial closures, mass unemployment and privatisation weakened the union's influence, and the decline of the workers' movement began. At the peak of production in 1978, there were 23,000 people working in the Cowley car industry. By 1982, this had fallen to 12,000. The first robots were introduced, and in partnership with Honda, Japanese cars were produced with the new management policy of increased production in less time using less labour on minimum wages for maximum profits. In 1987, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the divide between capitalism and socialism, came down when the communist bubble burst. The socialist cause became disillusioned, and the right wing developed in the unions and in the government. In the 90s, British Leyland became privatised as the Rover Group, and later was sold with sweeteners to British Aerospace. Asset stripping and restructuring took place, voluntary redundancies were offered, North and South works were shut down, and the assembly was moved to press steel. The unions, now in line with management, blocked any strike action against closure, and in 1993 the old factory closed and was pulled down. In 2001 it was sold to BMW, who still employ 4,300 today. In the new millennium, the world entered a silicon computer age of information and communication. Individuals began communicating locally and globally to share and express themselves in new ways. Old hidden knowledge is being revealed as new knowledge in every department of human understanding is expanding our reality of life on Earth. The 1930s saw electricity come into everyone's homes, lighting up and revolutionizing their lives. And in the 60s, television arrived to show people themselves and to see the global picture. In Cowley today, the cars that built workers' homes and set people free to travel and share the world's resources are clogging and polluting the streets, as rising oil prices are driving up food and heating costs. The capitalist culture has developed unimpeded by social conscience, resulting in the loss of civil liberties and employment rights. Women and ethnic minorities who struggled and attained equality in the 70s remain marginalized, and the security of a job, home and pension for everyone is uncertain. With minimum wage jobs, transient migrations, rise in prices, cuts in benefits, the disappearance of support groups and community resources, a third world culture is developing with a growing number of working poor. The old manor is now residential flats, and the factory grounds are home to the Oxford Business and Retail Parks. The Oxford Record Office is housed in St Luke's Church, where a labyrinth outside marks the Knight Templar's original path of intent. The Cowley Centre, which in 1989 was enclosed with a glass roof and named Templar Square, is populated by low-end stores and charity shops. A 99p store and a cash generator outlet reveals the poverty of the area. Described as Blackbird Lee's front room, it forms a focus for the community and encourages interaction with local schools and community groups for events and promotions. Many of the elder people have fond memories of the Cowley works, but most of the young families, students and immigrants who now live in the area are not often aware of Cowley's illustrious past, but can be certain of its future. 800 years ago, the Cowley Manor schooled the Knights Templar, who amassed great wealth by starting the first international banking system which funded the monarchy and its wars. The resulting empire over the next 700 years was won on the backs of the peasants. 100 years ago, the Cowley Manor became the Morris car factory, and the peasants became the working classes. They fought and won equal rights and better living conditions and demanded the democracy enjoyed today. May Cowley's people forever prosper. The story is still unfolding, and we are all the participants of its telling.